Our second case, we are staying in Florida as well, and I'm calling this a school shooting on Zoom. This is just very weird. It seemed as if school shootings were really on pause because schools have been closed because of COVID-19. Sadly, this shooting happened while there was a class in session on Zoom. It happened at one of the child's homes, and the teacher and the children could hear what was going on and started reacting to what was going on. And then ultimately, the teacher was very, very smart. She knew something was going down, so she muted that child's camera or computer, if you will, and it made it possible for the rest of the children not to be further traumatized by what was going on. It's just unbelievable. So let's get into the facts here. So the mother of one of the children, she was killed by her ex-boyfriend. This happened at 8 o'clock in the morning. School had just started. This was on August 11th. 32-year-old Maribel Morales was killed by 27-year-old Donald Williams, according to investigators. The Martin County Sheriff's Office says that there were 6 children in the home when this happened, ranging in ages from 10 to 17. 4 of the children belonged to Maribel. The other 2 were cousins who lived across the street and had come over to the home. And remember, it was the youngest, the 10-year-old, who was in class, in session, in front of her computer when this happened on Zoom. Can you believe this?
No, I mean, like you said, one interesting, weird silver lining of the pandemic is that because there hasn't been physical school, we haven't heard about school shootings. But this is kind of a weird Zoom version of that. And I'm so glad that the teacher was able to protect the rest of the classroom. But what about these 6 children who were in the home? And it sounds like they've all witnessed some part of this murder. And luckily, none of them were harmed, but I can't imagine just hanging out in the home, doing your daily activities, and all of a sudden something so horrible like this happening inside your own home.
I don't know how the children recover from this. And the 10-year-old who is sitting at her computer, according to the family, she's a special needs child. She has Down syndrome. So imagine this little girl sitting at her computer, happy to be back at school, classes in session, and all of this happens. This is what the teacher told investigators. She said, I heard some commotion, and I could hear that there was some arguing or a confrontation. So she said, so I clicked the girl's microphone onto mute. That's where everything was happening. And then, so she said, thank God the children did not hear the gunshots. They may have heard some of the arguing, but they didn't hear the gunshots. And that the teacher could tell something horrible was happening because then she saw the little girl put her hands over her ears and kind of scrunch her head down and her body down as the shots were being fired. And then as a result of the shooting, something hit her computer, the little girl's computer, and her signal went dead. So that was the last that the teacher knew of what was going on, and the last that the kids also in that class. So can you imagine this level of violence?
No, and I can't even imagine what the teacher was trying to do to calm the rest of the children. Hey, don't worry, I'm sure they're fine. I mean, what do you say? Because you don't know, and you have no idea. And when the computer shuts off like that, I mean, that's just, I mean, and in this case, of course, the worst has happened. But when you see something like that, of course, your mind goes to the catastrophe. That's something horrible must be happening.
And then, to be very clear about this 10-year-old girl, her mother has just been shot and ultimately killed. So hopefully she did not witness it because she was participating in class, but nonetheless, it happened right there in her own home, where she always, I'm sure, believes is the safest place to be. Investigators say that there was some kind of an argument, and that they say that Donald Williams went into the house early that morning and he confronted Maribel about a video. Something was bothering him about a video, and that the investigators say that when he showed her the video, she started to smile at him, and that's when he lost it. He became enraged and he shot her. So he takes off. This is what's so bizarre. This is the rest of the story. He takes off, but he doesn't have a car. So he gets on a public bus, and then he says to the bus driver, "Can you take me to Stuart, Florida?" Okay, so Stuart, Florida is a whole other town. This is not that kind of a bus. Mm-hmm. Bus driver. Okay, so we have a teacher who's very, reactive and smart. Now comes the bus driver, another woman. She gets off the bus. She calls 911 and says something very strange is going on here. Turns out that the sheriff's department SWAT team is doing a training drill nearby. So when 911, when the dispatcher makes a call saying something's going on a bus, we got a problem here, bus driver's calling for help, the SWAT team arrives at the bus, okay, because they were so close. They take Donald Williams into custody. They claim that he had a stolen gun on him. We still don't know whether that was the gun that he allegedly used to shoot Maribel. But the authorities say that Williams immediately confessed to the shooting. We'll see whether, that's going to be admissible or not. He is expected to be charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed home invasion. A little background on Maribel and Donald. They broke up about a year ago, and he was recently released from jail. He had been doing time for an incident involving domestic violence where she was the victim. It's like a recipe for disaster.
That's right. Because what we know about domestic violence is that it's an escalation. Usually you don't hear that there's never been that history with a couple and all of a sudden somebody gets shot, right? There was a history. There's clearly a history of aggression in this relationship by Donald to Maribel. So unfortunately, people sometimes feel like, okay, when I finally escape my abuser, perhaps I can be safe. But it is scary. You kind of almost have to always be a bit more on high alert, especially if they do know where you live. And I don't know if it's typical for him to just come into the house. I don't know what kind of relationship they had right before this, if they've argued back and forth, or if he sort of disappeared for a little bit and all of a sudden appeared. But it's so hard to imagine that Maribel would have knowingly let him into the house if she thought that she could be at danger or her kids could be at danger. I think that she must have trusted him to some level, even if he was angry, to say, okay, well, let's talk about it. What's wrong, right? I mean, it almost sounds like it's possible that Maribel was just trying to figure out what was the big problem. But the mistake, of course, was letting him into the house and possibly being a little bit too trusting if that's what happened.
And we don't know whether she let him into the house, whether one of the kids let him into the house, whether the door was unlocked. Remember, 4 of her children were there. They had 2 cousins from across the street. Class is starting in the morning, 8 o'clock. Probably the older kids are just having their breakfast if they're even up. There's a lot going on at 8 o'clock in the morning with that many kids in a house. So that's a possibility. We do not know the details of it, but the 4 children, Maribel's 4 children, they too have now been placed in protective custody. So we have all these children now in Florida in protective custody because of these 2 cases that we've just outlined. It's like an epidemic of crime and violence.
And I feel like people are frustrated. I know that that's a common sentiment nowadays. Lots of people are saying how frustrated they are. We know that domestic violence rates, at least the reported rates, are higher now. Now that we're several months into the pandemic. And it's very hard because I know this is early for us to know if Donald really planned this, going there thinking I'm going to kill her, or if maybe he just thought I'm going to threaten her. I mean, it's hard to know. It's interesting that he immediately confessed the crime. That makes me think perhaps there was a little bit of a impulsiveness to what he did. And he obviously didn't have a plan when he got on the bus and said, hey, take me to Stuart. So something about this feels slightly unplanned, but unfortunately that is how most domestic violence related deaths happen, is that it goes too far, like the person accidentally or in the time of passion ends up committing a murder. And what I think is so sad about this too is not only was the school teacher and the school students partial witnesses, these 6 children in the house were witnesses, and Maribel's fiance, who was on the phone with her. So the balls that Donald had to shoot Maribel while she was clearly on the phone with somebody, maybe he even knew that it was her fiance. But it just blows my mind how many people were witness to this horrific murder.
So, what happens to the children now? Because, there's a protocol to work with children who have been exposed to trauma and violence in a school shooting. But now, when something like this happens on Zoom, my question for you, Dr. Judy, is does it feel less real because it happened in a virtual manner? Is the trauma slightly different?
I don't think that it is. And for some people, it might feel even more traumatizing. Imagine if you were witness to this, you're in a Zoom meeting, you hear a loud noise that sounds like a gun, and then somebody's computer goes off. I mean, sometimes our imaginations will take us to some of the most traumatic places because you didn't actually get to witness what happened. And of course, now the children and the school teacher have heard what happened. And so they know once the computer went off what was really going on. And we know that PTSD doesn't only develop if you've directly experienced something, that PTSD actually can develop when you witness something or even hear about something when something happens to somebody that you know. So it could be a colleague, a coworker, in this case, a student, a peer, and you hear that this happened in their home. It can equally cause just as much trauma witnessing and seeing this secondhand on the computer. And so I would encourage whoever is in charge here to give that crisis protocol to everybody involved, the fiance, the 6 children who were in the home, the children on Zoom, the school teacher, just everybody, because I think sometimes it takes a little while before people can really process what happened. Trauma experiences and responses don't immediately provoke PTSD. Sometimes it takes months or years before people all of a sudden say, you know what, I'm having these nightmares and I can't explain them. So I think this is going to be a really important time to keep an eye on everybody who was witness in this case.
Dr. Judy, do you think that because it happened virtually and because we're dealing with children, I mean, she was 10, that it makes it perhaps more difficult for children to distinguish the violence that they are either seeing or playing on a computer, for example, or on television, versus something that has just been experienced, again, in this virtual way in a Zoom class?
Well, I do think that there's a little bit of a difference because I think when you are seeing something through a screen, it feels like a bit of a separation for some people. But conversely, I've actually also heard that people feel sometimes more intimate on Zoom. Like, for example, right now we're on Zoom and I can see you very clearly. It's like you're sitting even closer to me, maybe, than if we were in person at the studio. And so I've also heard that for some people, they feel like more emotionally connected on the computer. And certainly for our younger generation, they grew up with this environment, right? Like maybe for some of us, we're like, this is a weird shift. Like every meeting's on Zoom now. But for our younger children, this is equating to their experiences in the real world in many ways. Like they kind of grew up with computers and with screens and with FaceTime and all of this stuff. And so I think maybe for the younger children, it would have a different effect. It might feel more real to them than perhaps if you're somebody, who's a bit older and this is kind of more of like a barricade for you. Like this is a barrier versus something that happens to you directly in front of you in person.
Thank you.